Swamiji tells us of a conversation he had with Master, in which Master said, essentially, directly, that whatever desires you have to be fulfilled before you can attain God realization. And Swamiji said to him, rather horrified by the idea, even the desire for something as small as an ice cream cone? And Master said, oh yes, that too. Now, when we start thinking about that, it can be more than a little daunting in terms of our spiritual path. I left my sunglasses in Gurgaon, and I'm sensitive to the light, so it was very intense that I had to go out today and get a new pair of sunglasses. So we went to one of the local malls where they're having a happiness sale. You'll be glad to know, 50% off on happiness there, everything in the store. And I was just walking through the store, not thinking particularly about what Master said. Oh, that purse looks nice. Oh, that coat is kind of pretty. Those shoes are really attractive. All of these sunglasses look nice. I could get one of those and one of those. It just, isn't it so with all of us? We're just, especially in the world we live in, that movie looks attractive. I could learn how to do this. You know, that looks like a nice place to live. Oftentimes you walk down the street. I like this particular little house really quite a lot. Daya and Keshava have a similar house in Delhi. When I'm around these, I don't know, there's something about this particular design. I think, oh, how nice it would be just to take up residence here. Our minds are always just wandering around, sort of picking up pieces of the world with the idea that maybe I would be happier if I had this. I remember once with Swami Kriyananda, he was making travel plans, and in the first years that I was there, I worked with him as a secretary and just as a personal assistant. I did lots of things in his world, and he was making travel plans for somewhere. And there was a devotee, I believe in London, although I'm not entirely sure of the city, somewhere in England, who was not the easiest person to relate to, had a very strong personality, and it was not necessarily relaxing for Swamiji to visit him. He had a very short interlude on his journey, wherever else he was going, and we were trying to, he was sitting there next to the telephone, and he kept sort of reaching for the phone to call the man and then not wanting to, and I said, you're trying to decide whether you'd rather see him now or you rather reincarnate to see him again later. And Swamiji laughed and said, yes, that was pretty much the question. And he picked up the phone and he dialed the number, you know, do it now or do it later. Now, we find ourselves in our lives in all kinds of circumstances that we don't exactly remember choosing them. In our community of Ananda, because the children are raised with all of these ideas, sometimes the parents use these ideas, I want to say use these ideas on their children. Sometimes children conceive a dislike for their parents, especially when their parents are urging them to do things that they would prefer not to do. So Ananda parents have in their arsenal of parenting the opportunity to say, not my fault, you chose me, right? One of my friends, she didn't know this teaching when she was raising her son, but he was a grown man when she heard me say that, you know, we choose our own parents. This morning I was speaking a flash of light in the astral world, the moment of conception, and the child goes there, rushes to get into the womb. That's actually how Master put it. And when I said this to one of my friends in class, she came up to me afterwards and she said her 6-year-old son became very angry with her once. And like children do, he stomped out of the room and said, I don't like you very much, like that. But he decided that wasn't enough. And he come back and he said, you weren't even my first choice. she was fascinated and said, well, darling, who was your first choice? And he answered her completely like this: a lady in the Philippines, but she was taken. So when I talked about Master saying the flash of light, and Master phrased it this way: all those souls who are ready to incarnate, who are in tune with that, quote, rush to get in. And she laughed because she said her son has this habit of going forward for something and then stopping to think about it. Even as a grown man, she could see his soul in the astral world heading for the lady in the Philippines, then stopping for a moment, somebody else slipped in. Well, in our community, sometimes parents try to extricate themselves. Not my problem, you chose me. Now is a gentleman in the community who has no children of his own, but has served as a loving uncle to many of the children. And so those children would come to him and say, I never would have chosen them. Why would I have chosen them? You know how kids can be. So he goes to Swami. What am I supposed to say? Well, Swamiji's answer was actually very interesting. He said, in fact, you don't necessarily choose every single detail. There'll be a flow of energy that you'll choose. And sometimes he even said, you'll choose one member of your family. And it's like you'll intersect with one member, and then that member will intersect with others, so you'll get the whole crowd. Even though your primary attunement is with one. Swamiji was extremely close with his mother, very, very close with his mother, and his brothers and his father also, were close to him, but the mother was the force that drew him into the family. That was just the karma that was in place. But always, in every circumstance that we find ourselves, we have been drawn into it because it's the perfect combination of forces, not necessarily to please us, but to allow us to see whatever stands between us and God realization. We have this idea in our minds, a strange idea in our minds, planted into us by the ego, that somehow the way we want things to be is the way they should be. And we're working at all times with this completely other reality, which is we are children of our Divine Mother. And just as children are guided by their parents and often required by their parents to do things that they don't want to do at all, but the mother knows that this is really absolutely what the child has to do. And children's, capacity to assert their ignorant will is almost unlimited. You say to your child, you really can't have chocolate cake for breakfast. You won't grow up big and strong if you eat chocolate cake for breakfast. And the child says, yes, I will. Just like that. Yes, I will. Absolutely. Because we have no perspective. Just like a little child has no perspective. It doesn't understand vitamins. It doesn't understand building bones. It just knows in the moment, this is what it feels like. This is what I want. And a wise mother, calmly, lovingly, but absolutely without moving, just holds to that point of view. My sister raised a son, and her son was challenging to raise. And at one point, he was in his little car seat, and he had a pen in his hand that was a permanent marker. And she said it was her fault. Instead of taking it out of his hand, she said, put that away. I don't want you to ruin your shirt. So she holds herself responsible for that. So of course, the first thing he did was mark his shirt like this. And she says, well, now you've ruined that shirt. How are you going to get another one? He said, Daddy will buy me one. She was not fond of this answer. So she decided he would buy one. So they got his piggy bank, and he was of an age where the value of money was determined by volume, not by the coins. You know, he preferred pennies to quarters because there were just more of them. So she takes his piggy bank to the store, she guides him to pick out a shirt, and he's going to pay for it himself. So far, it's all fun. She gets to the counter, she opens his piggy bank, and she starts with the pennies because she really wants him to understand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 101, 102. He begins to see his entire piggy bank, going for this shirt. My sister has very strong will. So does her son. He started screaming. He starts pounding on the counter. He starts kicking the counter. 102, 103, 104. She absolutely would not give in. Just absolutely not. And he had to empty his piggy bank into that shirt. And everyone in the store is watching him scream. Absolutely not. I don't care what the consequences of this are. This is a lesson that you have to learn, and it's my job to learn it. On another occasion, just because I'm thinking of her, he wanted to do something. It was time to go home. He didn't want to go home from my parents' house. He was having a fit, and he was trying to persuade her. She looked at him like this. When I speak to you like this, have I ever changed my mind? He thinks for a minute. No. It's not going to start now. Now, these are qualities that we admire and not necessarily can emulate ourselves. But we admire them less when they're acted upon us by Divine Mother. Isn't that so? We have set in motion all of these, what I can only call unlearned lessons. That's what karma is. Here in India, we have all these ideas about karma that tend to be what I say undynamic. We tend to use the word karma as a reason why things are just going to roll on the way they've always rolled on. And there is a certain truth in that, but it's not a useful truth. One of the things about the spiritual path, the way Master taught it to us, and especially the way Swamiji has expressed it, is that this is spirituality from the inside out. This is spirituality that is not about getting all these ideas in order. It's about getting our own consciousness in order, about who we are. I mean, many of us who were brought to this teaching from America, everybody has advantages and disadvantages. Because we knew nothing about it, we could just take it as a clean slate. And everything that Swamiji said, we could just accept. People who had other ideas about Jesus had to work through those and so on. Here, you have a certain context that you're working with. And from my relatively limited experience, but enough to see the pattern, this idea of karma is an extremely important one to shift in your understanding. Karma is not an excuse. Karma is the fact of the unlearned lessons we were born to learn. And unlearned means simply this, that something can distract us from our single-pointed devotion to God. Or it's a desire that we had, that we need to live through to understand, its relationship to the infinite. And that's what we're doing. Our desires are not in themselves wrong, because that's how God works with us. We have to be propelled, as I was saying this morning, talking about Sri Yukteswar's description of why we're drawn to each other. We have to be propelled forward to have the experiences we need so that we can see who we are, what our energy is, and make choices. What do I really want? And Swami Kriyananda said something that's extremely important to remember. He said we learn a certain amount from being disappointed. It didn't come through for me. But he said we learn more from being fulfilled. Now that's a very different take on it, isn't it? We're always thinking, I have to renounce this desire, I have to become unattached about this. In the book I just published, a woman had asked me a question. Her son was in trouble. She was trying to be detached from him. I said, don't even dream of being detached from your son. How could you possibly be detached from your son? You know, you have to find your freedom another way than this. And so a lot of times we have strong desires. We want human love. We may be ambitious. We might want money. We want to be a success at some artistic or personal endeavor. And we get at war with ourselves. We begin to think that God doesn't want me to do this. In the Catholic teaching, there's a concept called over-scrupulosity, which means where you become more and more nervous about everything about yourself. And I remember at a period of time in my spiritual life, I started doing that. I started imagining that anything that I wanted, automatically God didn't. And what happens is your path gets narrower and narrower, and usually so narrow that you fall off of it. And I remember Swamiji, and the only word I can use is he pleaded with me because he saw that I was in such a scramble. And he pleaded with me. He said, God doesn't want you to be unhappy. He said, that's your idea. And I really had to think about that because I was beginning to think, if it made me miserable, it must be God's will. And if I wanted it, it must be against his will. But Swamiji tells us we learn more from being fulfilled. And let me follow that for a moment. Master also says that before we reach God realization, we try every single alternative to that. And Master meant that literally, that anything that looks like it might give us fulfillment, we give it a whirl. And that's why it takes so long. And he meant even like being a murderer, for example, you know, or stealing everybody else's money, or anything that any human being thought was a good idea. We all try it. And we find ourselves here, you know, horrified at the idea of being a murderer or stealing somebody else's money. Master's explanation for that is that we have tried it and it didn't work. I have a friend still who's in prison. He's in prison on a life sentence. As often happens in the so-called justice systems of the world, not everybody in jail is guilty, and this man is not guilty, but there he is, and there he has been for a long time. And the first time I met him, he was in a local jail, an American jail not far from our community, and he was looking at a long time in prison, and someone gave him Autobiography of a Yogi, and he knew that meditation would be a really good idea. And to his credit, he learned meditation. Jyotish went into the jail and gave him Kriya, and he has never missed his Kriyas every morning, every night. Every time I think of, maybe it's a little hard to meditate, I think of this man sitting in prison where every prisoner has their own television playing out loud, and he just does his Kriyas faithfully and regularly. But the first time I went to visit him, I was a little nervous about going into the jail, and the jail was like a movie set. It was like this big concrete hallway with these cells on either side with bars, you know, just like like if you were doing a Hollywood movie. And on both sides, they're men, and they're in these cells, and they're holding on the bars, and they're looking out. And I am walking as close to the center of the hall as I can, trying to take my female body and just shrink every part of it in, you know, and look as much like a tree as I possibly can. It was a moment. But it really had it had an amazing effect on my mind, because here these men have all just tumbled through some chaos that has gotten them arrested, and now they're behind bars. And you can feel them, even though they're not rattling the bars like that. You can feel with all their energy, they're pushing against those bars. But what was so striking to me, I mean, my intuition was pretty sharp because I was really focused. It was like I knew as soon as those men got out from under those bars, everything that had brought them in there would shoot them right out into exactly the same situation. Whether they got arrested this time or not, I couldn't say. But it was in them. It was, let me find a quick fix. Let me find a way not to be disciplined. Let me just fulfill my desires. Who cares who I hurt? It was a state of consciousness. Every state of consciousness that we are no longer attracted to, Master says, because we have tried it and it didn't work. There's a slang expression in America, maybe here, been there, done that. Swamiji liked that one. He rarely used slang. Whenever Swamiji, you don't realize that how much language has vibration and how much slang, these words have vibrations that are not refined. Swamiji would never use slang except occasionally. And whenever he did, the contrast between his vibration and those words, on one occasion, I remember he carefully described something as the pits, which means it's the pit of experience. And we all just burst into laughter because it was so far away from who he was. He rarely wore t-shirts with any print on them. My husband had a restaurant when Swami first met him, and he had a t-shirt with a logo on it. And I think out of friendship for David, Swami took that t-shirt and he often wore it. He used it for his pajamas for years. After he died, this is gonna make me cry. After he died, we were cleaning out his apartment and I found it in there. You know, Swami wore it David met Swami 30 years ago and it was still there. But every time I'd see Swami with that t-shirt or any on, and you would see his infinite consciousness committed to some little slogan. It was just so comical, which of course is why he never wore anything like that. He was so out of character. But in any case, what I was saying is that whatever we know because we really know. Oddly enough, we never learn from being told. We really don't. If somebody tells you something and you learn from it, it's because it vibrates with something that you already know. I mean, this is a tricky business about raising kids, but it has to vibrate with something you already know, or else it just goes over your head. A friend of mine made a very serious mistake in her life. I knew in advance that it would be a serious mistake. I know exactly where we were sitting when I told her. Later, when it proved to be disastrous, she said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I did. I told her where and when we were sitting and exactly what I said. She had no recollection of it because it was just words. There was no vibration. Now, what this means for us in a practical way is that we have to understand, just like the children are told by their parents, wherever we find ourselves right now, your age, your gender, the condition of your body, the culture that you're born into, all of this is perfectly designed for us to work through whatever unlearned lessons we have to learn. And one of the absolute keys to success on the spiritual path is to recognize not that my situation is good, not that I even like it necessarily, but it's exactly right for what I need to learn. And if we want to please God in any way, we have to take what's given to us and use it for our spiritual growth. We have to take into the deepest part of ourselves this understanding that this world is exactly balanced as it's meant to be. I've written several books now and I intend to write more. Writing for me was a challenging karma. I could do words in talking almost effortlessly, but writing confused me. There was just some karmic block that I had that Swami always knew, so he really pushed me on this. You know, when I first came to Ananda, I was so completely there for Swamiji, and very quickly I got right next to him. And I became his secretary, and I followed him around with a little notebook and a piece of paper. And I was certain that I would spend my entire life just following him around with that notebook and that piece of paper. And after 6 or 7 years, he told me that he wanted me to do something else, that I had other things that I had to do, and he said that I wouldn't be fulfilled unless I did those other things. My response was, why don't we try it and see if I am fulfilled? But he said no. He said, this is what's going to happen for you, and you're going to have to go forward in a very different way. It was extremely difficult for me. And one of the things that he wanted me to do was to write. And I always just had this, I suffered when I had to write. Actually, I'm going to tell you a story about this, just the amazing way sometimes that Swami worked with us. I had a writing project to do, and I was just having a terrible time doing it. And I came to Swamiji's house, and I was very emotional. I was much more emotional when I was younger than I am now, and I believe I was crying about how difficult it was, and I just didn't know what to do. And I was sort of engaged in this little drama, and I became aware of the fact that Swamiji was no longer sitting in front of me, but had walked over to a bureau that was right next door. Now, we had no electricity in those days, and the community was very, very dark at night because we were way out in the country. So we were highly dependent on our flashlights. And we were also extremely broke. We had very little money. So flashlight batteries were a major expense in all of our lives. So sometimes your flashlight batteries would get a little dim, but there might still be a little life in them. Now, I helped take care of Swami's house, and there was a drawer there where we would put the weak batteries, waiting to test them to see which had more life. You can imagine, it was not a job that anybody did when they had anything else to do. I'm sitting there, having this complete, to my mind, important experience. And Swami has stood up, he has opened the drawer, and he's testing the batteries. Yeah, he's testing the batteries. I was just like stunned, just stunned at what was going on. But it was very interesting. To say that I became upset with him would be untrue. But something about that just like stiffened up my spine. And I said, well, I guess I'll go home now, you know, kind of with this energy. And I carried that energy home, and I sat down and I did the project, just like that. Now, later, just to make this, I just remembered this incident the other day. I was telling it to Brian. I went home and I finished the project. I did a good job because I actually can write when I'm not crazy, when I'm not being, you know, even then I could. And so I did it, and I did it well, and Swamiji liked it. Swami threw away most of my writing, I should add, for the first 15 years, but occasionally I'd get a piece in that worked. And then that Friday, or whenever it was on the weekend, he had a satsang with the whole community. Here's what he said. Asha faced a very important test this week. I mean, I've never heard him say anything like this. Asha faced a very important test this week, and there was nothing I could do to help her. She had to just face it herself. And he said, and I'm pleased to say she did. And he actually said if she hadn't passed, she would have left the path. Oh, my God, you know, my breath just stopped like this. I said, Swamiji, why didn't you tell me like this? He said, I didn't think it would help. You know? Isn't that amazing? I mean, the whole cycle of that still just, even to this day, bewilders me. But you see, the masters are watching us, and they can help us to a certain extent, and they will help us to a certain extent. But at a certain point, it is up to us to make that choice. What's important to me? How much do I want to just wallow in my grief and my sense of victim and my sense of how small I am and, oh, this is so hard, "Oh, Swami, this is so hard." Master had a disciple. Remember, Swami tells us about it? And the disciple was very weak, and Master said, I call him my baby because I'm babying him. And Master said to the disciple, "Is that all right?" And the boy said, "Yes, Master." I'm babying him. And so God will baby us if we want the things of this world and just to go on as we're going. He says, fine. He doesn't interfere. Master, there's a story that Swami tells about a woman who came to Mount Washington with her young child. And Master tried to help the child and direct him in a more uplifted way, because children are the same as us. But every time Master made any suggestion to that child, the child would go and say, "Mommy, he's being mean to me." And Mommy said, there, dear, you don't have to listen to him. And Master tried to help him, and finally he said he gave him a model airplane. And the boy loved the model airplane and became an airplane engineer. It's just like, okay, if this is what you really need to experience, then go ahead and experience it. Now, all of us find ourselves, up to here with life experiences. We have homes, we have jobs, we have cars, we have all these things that we have to take care of. And we either just keep pushing them away and acting as if this is somebody else's fault. I would be different if I didn't have all these responsibilities. I remember there was a point in my life, my early years, my first 10 years almost at Ananda, I was completely impoverished. I was mentioning that yesterday. I lived in this tiny trailer where I couldn't even energize like that. I'd energize like this. For years, all of us who lived in those trailers all energized like this because you just couldn't get your hand all the way up. The ceiling was too low. I was completely impoverished. I didn't mind at all. I loved it. I like to think I could go back to that. If I get a chance, I'll find out whether I could or not. But I also had this underlying thought, as long as I'm poor, I'm spiritual. And then I shifted over and got married. My husband has never had any of those complexes. To him, everything is energy, and you just use your energy in whatever way is required. I had all these categories of what was spiritual and what wasn't spiritual, and I would put energy into this and refrain from here, and he just would move through life like this. And in the complexity of things, my trailer where I had lived was right next to Swamiji's house, and there was a lot of shift in the community, and suddenly there was nobody living close to him anymore. So there was this tiny little cabin. He invited David and me to move back, to live right next door to him. I mean, a no-brainer. Yes, of course we'll do it. Cabin was, I could live alone in such a cabin, but my husband's aura was so big. We walked into that cabin together, and it was almost like I was just flattened against the wall. There was just no room for both of us in that space. I said, "Swamiji, we can't live there." He said, "We'll build a house." Build a house? I mean, we had no money. And more than that, it frightened the socks off of me to think of building a house. It's like, if I have a house, how will I be spiritual anymore? I mean, it was really, I didn't know this, but it was really deep. David was, okay, we'll build a house. Why not? So I had this idea, okay, we'll build a house, but I'll make sure we build it badly. And that will show how detached I am. And so then we'll have an ugly house, and I can say, see, we have an ugly house. I'm not really caught here. And I played that out for a while until my husband is a man of many fewer words than me. He stores up the thought, and then he delivers it really directly. And he says everything I say in about a month. He says it in a couple of sentences. Bing! Like that. So after a little bit of this, he just looked at me and he said, "If you're not going to help, then at least get out of the way." Like this. Then I had to stop and ask. Well, of course, Swamiji himself had asked us to build this house. So, I mean, there's a clue. I don't know about what this is supposed to mean, but it was an extremely deep and profound lesson. I had decided to get married. I had decided to live a certain life. It brought certain things with us. And then Swamiji finished it by saying, you do not get out of karma by doing it badly. See, that was my thought. I'll just do it badly. And that will show how detached I am. No, no. That shows how afraid you are. Afraid of putting out energy. Afraid of really accepting who I am. Afraid of realizing that I really want this. I really want this. Now, Swamiji said, we learn more from being fulfilled than having our desires frustrated. And here's how that works. If you really think something will make you happy and you don't get it, you still imagine that it'll make you happy, don't you? And you come in lifetime after lifetime trying to get whatever that is, this particular relationship, this particular power, this particular position, and it festers within you. I believe I would be happier if I had this. And no amount of somebody telling you who has this, oh, this won't really make you happy. And we never believe, because we can't. It doesn't meet us. But when you have it, then you discover just how happy it does make you. And you must understand there's many wonderful and beautiful things in this world. You know, on one hand, this is an ocean of suffering, but it's also possible with the right consciousness to have wonderful experiences. You know, satisfaction of helping people, of doing your duty bravely and patiently, of experiencing refined love, of true friendship, good art. Many wonderful things can happen here, especially if we do it with the right attitude. But then you see what happens is, oh, that was really beautiful, but it's not enough. I've drunk that particular cup to the bottom, and I still long for God. And then, when we go forward for God, we really do it with the full, calm understanding that I'm doing this because I know what I want to be. Master makes a statement, I believe it's in Whispers from Eternity, I can't remember exactly where. It's not enough to be good merely because it is our habit to be good. He said we have to choose virtue because we know without a doubt that my true happiness lies in that direction. And this path of self-realization is not easy. Nobody can just lay out the rules for you. Now you do this, you remain poor, you do these particular things, you live in the monastery, you're not a householder, you live in this city, you don't live there. There's no rule book. Absolutely none. The only rule book is, where am I standing? Where is God drawing me? And realistically, where am I drawing myself? Who am I? There was a certain point in our community when our community was defining itself from the outside. And everybody began to think that I need to be a certain way or else I'm not spiritual. And then Swamiji just created a whole new reality for himself and for the community. And he woke us all up to the idea that spirituality grows from the inside. It grows, as I've said several times recently, like an apple seed becomes an apple tree. It's a marvelous image when you think about it. When I left home, there was a flower bulb, a hyacinth actually, that someone gave us as a gift just a day or two before I left home. In a little glass vase, sits on the windowsill, and you can see the roots growing and you can see the green shoot growing. And they're really pretty when they blossom, but probably the cycle of that plant is exactly the cycle of my absence from home. So I stood in front of that hyacinth and I asked it if it would bloom tomorrow. You know, I'm going to be across the world, I'm going to miss you, and I'd really like to see you. And the little hyacinth just sort of said to me, can't do it. Much as I'd like to, can't do it. You know, I'm just a little root and a little green shoot, and I'm just going to have to go through the whole cycle to reach my fulfillment. And there's a certain point on the spiritual path where we have to just really settle in. We just have to settle in and realize the raw material of who I am is what my sainthood is going to be made from. In the early days of Ananda, when we were all just trying to figure this out, there was a lot of what I can only call play acting at being a devotee. And I'm looking for something this one woman, she always wore white, and she carried a little book of masters, and she kind of would wander around like this. And then when anything would happen, she would turn like this and she would open her little book, like this, and look at it. She didn't last, I will add. I was raucous, I was unpredictable, I was noisy, I was messy, and I never, ever did that. And one time I remember I was working for Swamiji as his secretary, and something was really annoying me. And I was in the public area of the market, and I was expressing myself in my usual enthusiastic way. Jaya is smiling because he knew me then. And I was making a certain commotion. And someone said to me like this, "You're Swami Kriyananda's secretary, and it's not appropriate for you to behave that way." I didn't like that. I said, "I am Swami Kriyananda's secretary, and I am behaving this way." Like, get over it. But the fact of the matter was that was very important learning. My behavior was not admirable, and I really did my best myself to get over it. But that's how God made me. And I was going to have to grow like that hyacinth, just from the seed that I am. And the only way to get there is through who I am, what I want, what my desires are. Definitely, we should work as hard as we can to put ourselves on the right road. We don't want to be like those men behind the bars just trying to break out and make more misery for ourselves. Who would want to do that? But don't imagine for a second that God will be found more quickly from any other place than exactly where we're standing. And all of us, are faced with challenging circumstances, long hours at work, perhaps underpaid, temptations to be dishonorable, people who don't understand, children that seem like a good idea at the time that we birthed them, but now we wonder, just all of the things that we were not really thinking clearly when we did it. But it's the force of the soul within us brought us right here, and we will not get out of the karma by doing it badly. The only way we will be able to do it is to do it beautifully for God. And to realize that it's just my choice. I must have wanted this. It must have something to teach me, or else I wouldn't be here. Don't worship it and think it's something other than it is. It's not important in itself, but it is the highway that each of us is going to be asked to walk. And just that relaxation, just that realization that I am wearing the life that fits me perfectly. In The Art and Science of Raja Yoga, Swamiji has a sentence in there somewhere that I didn't notice for the first 30 times that I read the book. But he said, essentially the process of progression from one incarnation to the next, and he was also talking about through the animal level. Our consciousness expands to a certain point of awareness and refinement. And then when it's time for us to incarnate, just as Master said, the flash of light in the astral world if we're human, and the right flash of light that matches us, we make a body that gives us the opportunity to express who we are. And he says that's how animals progress. A lizard has a certain number of options. And once the individuality that is the lizard has finished the capabilities of lizardness, then he casts off that body and maybe he gets to be a rat. wow. And then he gets to experience everything a rat experiences. And he may notice the cat has more option than the rat. But with each of us, you see, we incarnate in the place and in the time and in the form that gives us the opportunity to express the vibration of consciousness that we are ready to express. And we keep that body as long as it serves us. The moment it ceases to be a vehicle for our consciousness, it falls away with no more matter to us. You know, our pets die, they're finished. Remember the story in Autobiography of a Yogi of Master and the Fawn? And he wanted the fawn to stay a fawn because he loved it, and the deer came to him and said, "You are holding me back." And then Master released him, and the animal died almost immediately. Well, that's also true for all of us. And if we rebel against the exact position our karma has put us in, all we do is spin our wheels and waste time. You know, I am Swami Kriyananda's secretary, and this is how I'm behaving. And I later learned to say in my life, I'm not proud of it, but I'm not ashamed either. You know, it took me a lot of incarnations, as I often say, to get this confused, right? So I have to have a lot of respect. I put a lot of work into this point of delusion. I didn't get here casually. You know, so we have to just relax in that. And realize also what Master said. The moment we have a desire for God, now see, that's the other part of what Master said. Whatever you have a desire for absolutely will be fulfilled. And so if the least desire for God has arisen within you, it's certain that that will be realized. And that puts everything into perspective. So my poor little hyacinth couldn't bloom for me, you know, but it's there right now and it's working its way to a flower. I asked, Master said he remembered all the way back to being a diamond. Master said he remembered his individuality back to the point of being a diamond. I mean, I can't understand that. A friend of mine said, well, how long did it take him to get out of being a diamond? Which was a fascinating question to me. So I had the opportunity to be sitting at the breakfast table with Swamiji, so I took advantage of his helplessness and said, how long did it take Master to get out of being a diamond? Swami said, that is the stupidest question I've ever heard. I by now have learned to be a little more comfortable in myself, and I said, I thought it was a very interesting question, sir, that's why I asked you. And he kind of went, you know, just dismissed me. But as often happens with Swamiji, then a moment later, he turned and he answered, compared to eternity, all time is short. So think about us. You know, that moment will come when all of this will be compared to eternity. And compared to eternity, it means nothing. And that moment will come much quicker, the more completely we just relax into it. This must have seemed like a good idea because here I am. And then how beautifully can I do this with God? That doesn't mean you succeed in a worldly way or please all the people around you, because we're not talking about externals, inner consciousness. How beautifully can I do this with God? Because how quickly and how beautifully we do it with God tells us how quickly we learn, and how free we become, and how soon that moment of eternity will be ours. All right, God bless you.